Okay, good morning, Dad. Today
Good morning.
is Wednesday, October 30th, and we'll try to touch on both the Middle East and the Ukraine-Russia conflict today. But I'll start you off in the Middle East.
Okay.
Just so in the last episode you seemed fairly confident that Iran was going to strike back at Israel. Do you still believe that?
I do. I I've heard other statements from Iran, that they will in fact, retaliate. I mean, I guess some people are arguing that maybe, they're not talking about a direct retaliation, but something else. But I believe that they will. And Israel has said that it's going to strike again. So there's just no question that we're going up the escalation ladder.
Wait, so Israel says it's going to strike again after
Yeah.
this so-called successful attack by them?
Right. Yeah. I think it's a sign that did not achieve its objectives, and they're going to try again. That's not how they're putting it. In one case, they actually are justifying it by the assassination attempt on Netanyahu. Remember, I guess there was a few programs ago I was saying that, speculating that it could be a false flag. Well, it turned out not to be a false flag. Um, uh, Hezbollah took credit for it a couple days later, and but at the same time, I also pointed out, which seemed very suspicious to me, that they immediately attributed it to Iran, and they were going to use it as some kind of justification, and that's what they're doing now. They say, well, because of this, we have to now launch another strike against Iran.
Yeah, I was asking that question because I was wondering if you thought that it was a wise move for Iran to retaliate.
Well, I yeah, I think they just have to. It's clear that they've been very reluctant to get into this war, but there's really no other way to deal with Israel. It's funny how Israel and the West will talk about their adversaries as only understanding force. Again, I think it's a case of projection. They're the ones that only understand force. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't know how to use diplomacy. When the other side, like Russia or Iran, does something, a gesture of goodwill, shows obvious restraint and hopes that that restraint will be reciprocated, the West or Israel always immediately sees weakness. They see blood in the water, and they attack again. And I think both Russia and Iran they have learned that they simply, that they have to set aside the diplomacy. Again, like Pezeshkian, attempted diplomacy during the first couple months of his term, and it failed. He found out that, well, Israel just kept on assassinating people, and the U.S. Lied to him. And so he's just like, okay, he's learned the lesson that his predecessors have learned. You just can't, it's unfortunate. That's the way things should be resolved. But with these people, these countries, you cannot do that. These governments. So yeah, like this recent, it would be a mistake to consider like the Israeli attack a retaliation. It was another attack on Iran. It's Iran that's retaliated against Israel, because Israel attacked Iran again and again over the course of actually many years, and then especially during the last several months. And finally, Iran responded. And so further attacks really you can't by Israel can't be described as retaliations. They're just continued attacks. And I think that so it's important and the fact that they're attacking shows that Iran has not yet established effective deterrence, and they need to do that. So that's one thing they need to do. And also, looking at it in kind of a more practical, realistic sense, I think already Iran has demonstrated that it has the ability to hit Israel and to do real damage to it. And Israel has shown itself to be a paper tiger. So why not? Okay, well, we're gonna have to establish deterrence, and we can't because it looks like Israel really can't do anything.
Right. Well, I guess why not? Because we don't want a huge, wider regional war where the United States gets pulled in,
Yeah,
other powers do. Obviously, Israel does want that. Iran doesn't. And you can say
yeah,
that diplomacy isn't an option, but it seems that Israel's doing a good job of kind of destroying itself. As it goes on, the more it does, it hasn't achieved any of its military objectives, not in Gaza, not in Lebanon. There will continue to be more and more unrest. I heard that up to 1 million Jews have left Israel already, which is a large proportion. If we think about, I think population of Israel is around 9 million. 2 million of those were Arabs, so
right.
that's a sizable part. Close to
Sure.
15%. So if Iran just sort of waits, you could see that Israel's also proven itself to be kind of impotent. They said that this was a watershed moment when they launched this attack on Iran. They tried and they really weren't that successful. Now the veil has been lifted and maybe Israel can just flail around. And the more it tries to do, the more it's actually harming itself and it can sort of self implode and we can avoid a wider regional war. Do you think that's possible?
That's possible. No, I know you're putting forward I think a reasonable analysis, a very reasonable analysis, and you may be proved right. Maybe Iran will hold off. We'll see that there's really no need to. But I guess at the same time, it looks clear. It's clear to me that Israel is going down, has not given up its plans to attack Iran. It's already stated, that it's going to attack Iran again. And I think that, they're going to, so.
Can you tell me more about the statement? When was it made? Who made it? Because I didn't see
I
this.
think I've seen it twice. Okay, now, I'll have to admit that I didn't really follow it back to its source. I've seen it on Telegram channels, which are, have been generally reliable, but are not 100% reliable. At least on two different occasions, 2 different days, yesterday and the day before. And it was supposed to be a statement, again by, the official Israeli statement by the Israeli government. So, maybe, again, there's just, and there's a whole lot of fake news out there, I admit it, and maybe I was taken in by it, but it seemed credible to me. That's all I can say.
Okay. Okay, so do you think that diplomacy really isn't an option here at all? That
No,
escalation is the path?
right.
But surely there is some type of diplomacy going on between Iran and the U.S. We've seen this before.
I
Do you
don't think there
that's
is
happening?
now. Actually, Iran even said, prior to the Israeli attack, that they were not communicating with the U.S. anymore. They didn't see a point to it. They just had been lied to too many times, and so, and maybe they have reestablished some channels of communication, but at this point, why?
Okay, well, we said that it was a watershed moment. The whole world was watching what happened, and really Israel failed to perform on the world stage in front of everybody. And nobody saw that more clearly than the Middle Eastern countries. So this had to be changing their calculations. Do you think that how will this affect these other countries, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, all these countries in the region, their relationship with Israel and the United States? And do you see a way that they would become more involved in this conflict?
I don't see them becoming involved in the conflict now. I don't think there's any chance of that. But it will just accelerate the trend that began earlier, that began following October 7th. And that is this steady drift. It actually even began before October 7th, but the steady drift from away from the U.S. and, let's say, towards BRICS. A lot of countries, Saudi Arabia is the best example of this. It's sitting on the fence, right? It actually, it was supposed to become a member of BRICS. It has yet to become an official member of BRICS, but it appears not to have rejected the offer that was made to it, nor to have fully accepted it. So, for example, Bin Salman did not go to Kazan to attend the BRICS summit, but he did send his foreign minister, and that's typical of Saudi Arabia. They're sitting on the fence right now. And UAE, which is actually has a very close relationship with the U.S. and has, an American, I think a very major American base there on its small territory, did actually attend BRICS, with its president attended, and has been very, has fully committed itself to the BRICS project. But neither has it cut its relationship with the West, and especially the U.S. But but this event, the obvious success of Iran, the failure of Israel, is going to push them farther from the U.S. and it's going to push them. It's going to continue to carry this trend forward. This trend away from the U.S. into BRICS. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's another milestone. On that, I think, transition that eventually will be made.
What do you think that means for the U.S. and the West if Saudi Arabia and the UAE begin to hop off the fence and onto the side of BRICS and away from the United States? What are the implications for the United States when that happens?
Well, actually, an example. The economic relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia is very important. I mean, of course, Saudi Arabia being like the world's largest supplier of oil, but also Saudi Arabia, because of all this oil money, buys a lot of very expensive weapon systems from the U.S. Now, interestingly, I heard this before the attack on Iran. For the first time, Saudi Arabia chose to buy air defense systems from Russia and not from the U.S. They've had entirely U.S. systems, the Patriot and other systems. This time, it wasn't one of the major systems that Russia has. It's a kind of a local tactical system called a Pantsir. But they decided to buy a number of Pantsirs from Russia, and that's a first. So, I mean, that's one example of what implications there are. They are an important buyer of military equipment, for example. They got a lot of money. But yeah, within the region, it's going to mean a lot. I mean, it's already just the fact that they and other Gulf states chose to be neutral, I think really changed the whole complexion of the, conflict between Israel and Iran. And if eventually they actually go over to the Iranian side, I don't see that happening, but, maybe years down the road, that would just change everything entirely. And there wouldn't even be any question of attacking Iran.
Okay, so it would just have an effect really on U.S. Foreign policy, the MIC, our military bases in the region.
It would just, it would be
an empire-ending thing, but it wouldn't necessarily affect us, our economy.
Yeah, no. It might again be for the empire is not. I know there's some leftists who think that the empire somehow benefits or makes, the U.S. economy, but it does not. It's a drain on the U.S. economy. If we bring our boys home, if we close the bases, we'll be better off here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's nothing really to worry about if these countries begin.
No. I mean, the only thing to worry about is just the reaction of the U.S. foreign policy and military elite. That would be a severe blow to them. I mean, they've had this presence in the Middle East ever since the end of World War II, and they've understood that as being key, to American prestige and security. I don't think it's really key to security, but I think that's the way they understand it. To lose that region would be, and of course the implications for Israel are huge, and we're very closely tied to them. So it could create a real panic, and who knows how they would react.
Yeah, it seems like the Western MIC, the U.S. military-industrial complex, has been irreparably damaged in the past couple of years, really since the beginning of the Ukraine war, and we're kind of seeing more and more sort of military failures, military hardware failures from the United States in terms of, these very expensive weapon systems are just not performing the way that we would expect them to perform, especially for the price tag. Do you believe that our MIC has been irreparably damaged? And
I wouldn't say at this point. I think its reputation, no question, has been damaged. The Ukraine war did that above all, but and is continuing to have that effect. But I wouldn't say that the damage is irreparable. I mean, it could tomorrow. We could reorient it. Our policies but it's just not going to happen. That's the problem. So, I mean, theoretically, we could get out of this, and it would still take years, because when you're talking about production chains and, just creating whole new institutions and so forth, we're talking a project of many years. But, well, even that appears, it's not, there's no indication that any such reorientation is taking place. It's just like all the rhetoric that you get from our political elite is the same old rhetoric. We number one, and just give them more money. That's obviously not the solution. There needs to be a whole restructuring of the MIC.
Right, but just if you're a country that's involved in the military procurements in your country, basically, whenever the U.S. makes an announcement that they're going to be sending some type of weapon to the Ukraine theater or for Israel to use, or Israel's using some type of weapon, and it just falls short. This is the big sales pitch that the MIC has given to the world. And I feel like every single time we get up on stage and say, okay, take a look at this. Look at what the HIMARS are going to do. Look what the TACMs are going to do. Look what these Excalibur glide bombs are going to do, or artillery shells will do, whatever it is, F-16s, F-35s, and they all fall short. The Patriot missile system. So then it just comes clear that people will be like, I don't want to buy this stuff. If this stuff doesn't work, especially if you're going against an adversary that has, electronic warfare that the Russians use, or their air defense systems, then these systems are not worth much, right? So I feel like that there's not any way you can really turn that around, right? I mean, you just mentioned Saudi Arabia's not buying.
Yeah, right. You could turn it around, but it's like I said, it's going to take years.
Decades, right? I mean,
it could be. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, we still have a lot of resources at our disposal, but no, there's no question our reputation is taking a hit. At least it's clear that these weapon systems aren't really what they've been made out to be when dealing with peer adversaries or near peer adversaries. They're great, of course, when you're attacking defenseless, poor countries like Gaza or Lebanon. But if you have any other, actually want to defend yourself from a 21st century country, let's say, a country with a 21st century military, you probably should look elsewhere.
Right. So I think it's fair to say that the Western military might has taken a huge blow, and who knows if it will recover. So that kind of dominance, that pillar has been severely weakened.
Right.
That military.
Again, these things they don't happen as fast as you might think. We see it. A lot of other people see it who are really focused on it. Most people, even heads of government, and you would think would immediately recognize what's going on, and I'm sure some of them do, but a lot of them take a while to actually reassess and to reorient. It's like turning around a super tanker. So you won't see the effects of the reputational damage immediately. I mean, we're seeing some, like I just gave that example in Saudi Arabia, but it's something that's going to play out over the course of the next few years. Of course, it could accelerate if there are other obvious, spectacular failures on the part of Western weapon systems.
I would love to be able to just see a chart, annual report on total sales from the United States, excluding Israel and the Ukraine, because it seems like so much of our equipment that we give is just our own money that we spend on ourselves we just launder through our MIC. But how many people are independently forking money over for these systems now? I bet it has to take a huge dive.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a huge dive. I'm sure there's been a dive. We'll see. You may be right. On the subject of Israel and its and U.S. weapon systems sent to Israel, I saw a figure just the other day that 70% actually of the weapons that Israel has been using and ammunition bombs and so forth that Israel has used since October 7th has been supplied by the U.S. So they've only 30% of it is actually indigenously produced. 70% of it has come from the U.S. So again, that tells you again that if we wanted to end this conflict, we could. They are utterly dependent on us.
Right. Well, it just shows how complicit we are in everything that Israel is doing. I think
Right,
that's the big
absolutely.
thing.
Right.
So we just were talking about our military reputation being damaged, but I think the more important thing is that our moral standing has been damaged incredibly. I mean, you said again and again, and I agree with you that Israel's reputation has been irreparably damaged. That is now the most hated country in the world. But then us, by extension, we are also becoming maybe the second most hated country in the world because we are the one that are allowing this to happen, that are complicit in it, supplying 70% of the munitions that are helping to carry out the Gaza and genocide and all of these horrific bombings in Lebanon. For Israel, though, when its reputation has been irreparably damaged, I think it's more of an existential thing that has happened to Israel, that they can't come back for this, that they're a small country, they are completely reliant on their Western benefactors. And we're seeing their Western benefactors starting to give them the cold shoulder a little bit. In Europe, we're seeing signs of it. The U.S.
Right.
is still holding strong, but civilian populations within the United States and countries that are the benefactors of Israel are also starting to wanting to distance themselves.
Starting to. Yeah.
Right. So just the long-term trend, no matter really what happens in this conflict, it seems that Israel's days are numbered because of this fact that its reputation has been irreparably damaged. But it's not the same case for the United States. Its reputation has also probably, I would say, irreparably damaged. When the history books are written in the future, 10 years from now, when we look back on it, we won't be able to. Yeah, well, it'll become increasingly difficult to deny the genocide in Gaza once this is all over and we uncover everything. If the ICC and the ICJ go through and find the rulings of genocide, then at this point, the U.S. reputation is irreparably damaged, but it's not existential for us, right? So what is it? What do you see happening in the United States when this happens? Or do you agree with what I said just to begin with?
Well, yeah. Again, the U.S. being such a large country and with out there in the New World with between two oceans, can make a mess of all kinds of things, right? And then just return home and not suffer the consequences. I think that's going to remain true to some extent. I mean, but not entirely. I think already our reputation has been damaged by what's gone on in Ukraine and what's gone on in Israel so far. It's only going to be worse. Yeah, the question is, how far we go. Let's say it all ended now, I think we would be scarred, we would be damaged. We certainly don't have the the control over much of the world that we once had. But as we pointed out, that actually doesn't really hurt us. But I think maybe, as always, it's really a question of how the elite deals with this. I mean, if the average citizen, may go on and not really know that anything had happened, but our elites are very, passionately devoted to these different causes. Whether it is to the weakening of Russia or to the strengthening of Israel, these are, for them, they're like existential struggles. They're not existential struggles for most of Americans. Again, Israel is something of an exception there that we've talked about earlier. So the big question is really, how do they deal with it? And it's hard to see them just like a turtle, just pulling its head into its shell and saying, okay, well, I don't want to deal with this anymore. There's a real chance that there's going to be, that I think we're seeing, indications of already, that they will lash out. They will attempt to recover the hegemonic position that they once had. And I think that's what we're seeing. Part of it is it's been a very irrational response. The like, for example, to the reputational damage. It's the U.S.'s response hasn't been, okay, yeah, maybe we should actually start behaving differently, and demonstrate to the world that we actually are concerned, about human rights and so forth. Maybe we should stop supplying weapons to Israel, for example. But there's no sign that they're going to do that. Instead, they've gone on this all-out attack on RT and Sputnik, the Russian news agencies, and claim that they seem to believe, I think they really do, it's like the reason that most of the world is turning against us is not because of our idiotic, actually evil policies, but because of, Russians telling lies about us. And if we can shut that down, we'll be okay. Now, that's just an absurd response, but that's a response that we've seen, and I think we'll just see more of the same. I think, there's going to be a lot of lashing out and flailing, and, who knows where it's all going to lead. It's kind of, sometimes it's comical, but, there could be real dangerous repercussions, especially if it involves military action.
Well, the more that the United States has been lashing out, in my opinion, it seems like the weaker and more childish and immoral we become, and the world sees us that
certainly.
way.
No, I think that's right. I mean, that's it's the problem, I think, within the West in general. It's just that the West exists within a bubble. So they when they talk about the international community, I think they really believe it. But their so-called international community, of course, is just the collective West, and they talk to each other, but they just don't listen to what the rest of the world says. If things don't, if they hear something that doesn't really is not consistent with the things that they believe, they hear something from outside the bubble, they just reject it out of hand, or they call it Russian talking points. They've become, kind of a very closed, inward-looking society, and which is, again, it's a very bizarre phenomenon. But it's, I've been observing this for years and years, and it's just becoming more and more obvious and intense as the years go by.
Right. So this lashing out, and it seems to just be hastening the demise of the empire. So the more we lash, and it doesn't seem like we're able to do, we're not even doing that much damage with our lashing out. I mean, of course, there's been horrific damage in Ukraine and what we've seen in Gaza. But I mean, in terms of it breaking out into just a full out war, I don't see the U.S.'s ability to conscript troops and put people on the ground. I hope that we will run out of gas soon. Do you think that's possible? That, how much flailing can we do? We've been flailing, and the flailing overall, to me, has been kind of pathetic. And so will the flailing, will we start getting, lobbing bigger bombs and get out of control?
Well, I mean, there's always
weaker and weaker,
Right. Who knows? I guess I'll repeat what I said, I think, in our last episode. It's just that it's really impossible to predict the actions of an irrational actor. When you're talking about, maybe a government that is cruel, brutal, but clearly logical and self-interested. And I think you can say that about quite a few governments in the world. It's rather easy to predict how they'll behave, because they'll behave in a self-interested way. They'll do the rational thing, the thing that's in their own interest. But the U.S., the collective West, is becoming increasingly irrational, and so I can't predict how they're going to respond to a continued decline in their prestige and power. It's just going to be irrational. That's all I can say, really.
Okay,
I wish I could be.
That'll all right, dude. Well, that's fun. We'll just have to see. Something else that I've been thinking about that could potentially resolve the conflict in Israel-Palestine is if there's more unrest within Israel itself. Because I've heard there have been tensions between Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, and Netanyahu. And for a while there, it looked like Benjamin Netanyahu was going to sack Gallant because Gallant was refusing to go into Lebanon. Eventually, it seemed like they figured something out and Gallant went and did it. But it seems like clear the IDF did not want to do this, and now they're there, and it seems like tensions between Gallant and Netanyahu are rising again, because I think there is a sense of a little bit of realism in within the IDF, realizing like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I told you this wasn't going to be easy. Going to Lebanon, attacking Iran isn't going to be easy. Now we're in this pickle, and we're getting bogged down. So, is there a chance that there could be something that would happen internally within Israel where we would see potentially a coup or large civil unrest or a mini civil war? That there are these different factions within Israel that could tear Israel apart itself, helping us get to a resolution without
Uh-huh.
nukes being
Well,
dropped.
yeah, I think, especially, okay, when you're winning, everyone is united. Everybody wants to be on a winning team. But when you start losing, then you start to see the backbiting and, the scapegoating. Nobody wants to take the blame. And so, yeah, I think there is the potential for some serious conflict within Israel. We've already seen some signs of it. We have these militias that are have grown increasingly in power and are outside of the regular structures of the military. And then the IDF. Yeah, the IDF leadership is not really happy with Netanyahu, though I don't think we want to make too much of the differences. I think sometimes like the differences between Gallant and Netanyahu are more a matter of personality than anything else. I know that Gallant just a couple days ago came out with some sort of statement on how Israel is lacking any sort of clear vision, or its military effort didn't have a clear vision or clearly stated objectives. And I read through it. In the end, to be honest, it didn't really sound too different the way that Netanyahu talks. I think there would be, if like Gallant had his way, we might see some differences. Maybe policy vis-a-vis Gaza might change slightly. There would be more of an effort to bring the hostages home, but I don't think the differences there are really all that significant. He just may be more cautious, and maybe he doesn't like certain kinds of rhetoric, but clearly, he's complicit for example, in the genocide, both in, the obvious genocide in Gaza and the incipient genocide in Lebanon. Yeah, and maybe just more of an approach rather than real objectives. Like when he stated his objectives, it looked like the same objectives to me that Netanyahu has. Yeah, but there obviously are. So, just like I was saying, it's like when a ship starts to sink. It's just like people go rushing for the lifeboats, and if somebody's in the way, you get pushed out of the way or whatever. There's going to be conflict. I guess I don't know enough about Israeli society and all the dynamics of what's internal dynamics to understand exactly what could happen. And I don't know that anybody really knows, but clearly there are strains. And those strains are going to get worse over time. And there are a lot of angry, well-armed, violent people. And, we could see some real conflict within Israel. I don't think there's any question about it. I think you're right.
Okay, there's something to monitor. But do you feel like the Israeli ship is beginning to sink? Is that when people are?
Yeah, I think it's right. They've suffered their first serious military reverses just in the last month. One is Lebanon, which appears to be just a total disaster, worse than 2006. We pointed to 2006 at a time when the Israeli army, the IDF, was clearly defeated. They failed to obtain their objectives and they had to give up. They made very little progress and they just had to retreat. They've made even less progress this time. From what I understand, they haven't even taken a single village. They're right there on the border, and they keep on sending in units, and the units just get chewed up, and then the tanks blown up, soldiers killed, and hundreds wounded, and then they try, again, with the same result. Hezbollah is fighting fiercely and clearly have prepared for this. Some thoughts that decapitation strikes were going to somehow reduce the morale of the Hezbollah fighters have been proven just utterly mistaken.
So do you see Israel just continuing this in southern Lebanon? It sounds like they're just crashing up against the rocks, sending in a
Yeah.
wave. They don't make
Yeah.
any
No, no.
progress.
Again,
Go
it's just
back.
Israel's in a, and of course the other one is Iran. So, I mean, those are both serious reverses. And, I don't think it's penetrated into public consciousness, but it certainly is going to have penetrated into some elite consciousness, especially people associated with the IDF. They've got their people there who clearly understand what's going on, and they must be very alarmed. So anyway, I actually forgot your question. I'm
Well, I
sorry.
was just wondering, are they going to continue this same strategy? It seems like
Well,
they're breaking up in
yeah.
southern Lebanon, and their
right.
waves get repelled. They haven't captured
Yeah.
anything, not taking
Actually,
any
I saw a
territory.
couple of statements. I haven't seen it confirmed. I should do a better job of actually following up and looking for confirmations. But that actually, I saw a statement before the Israeli attack on Iran, and then after. I think both came from Israeli news. I don't know how reliable the sources are, because I haven't, seen them in the mainstream. Not that the mainstream is necessarily any more reliable. I think often it's less reliable. But it's
Yeah, no, you
but these
Google
kind of things,
anything
yeah, right.
mainstream.
But it's
because
good to have some sort of, get let's say the reports. If you see it across a wide spectrum, then you can, including dissident media, then I think you can start to be more confident in the truth of something. But anyway, there were reports that the IDF was going to declare victory essentially in Lebanon and withdraw within like a few weeks.
How can
So
they
it's just,
declare
yeah.
victory if
Yeah,
people
well, they'll
can't
just
return?
do it. Obviously they'll say that their objectives were achieved. It's one thing that they didn't ever make very clear what their objectives were. And I remember at the time some people were pointing out, well, that'll make it easier for them. If they fail, then they can just make something up. And, they'll say that they destroyed some underground center and whatever, and inflicted huge losses on Hezbollah and blew up, 80% of their missiles or something, which actually they've already said. I think it's utterly false. But it's just not going to work because, you're going to withdraw. Obviously, one of the objectives, whatever they say, was to end the missile barrages, the rocket barrages, so that the northern Israeli residents could return to their homes. And it's not going to end.
Exactly.
So
That was what I was
clearly
going to
they
say.
failed, right?
Right. I was going to say maybe they can declare victory, and it might convince just casual observers of the war and other countries in the West that will fall for the propaganda. But the Israelis will know that it's not a victory. Because for them, the clear objective is to allow these 60 to 80,000 displaced Israeli residents to return to their homes in northern Israel, and that's not going to happen. If anything, it seems like the rocket barrage has increased. We're
Oh
seeing,
yeah, they certainly have, and
we're probably seeing more. I don't know if that number of 60, 80,000 has been there for a long time.
yeah,
I'm
no,
wondering
actually, quite a
because
few. Yeah, I think actually there are probably
much
many
more.
more. Yeah. Since the war broke out and the rocket barrages have increased and have gone, they're striking farther south and
Right into Haifa.
striking
It's like
right
big
right.
cities.
So I'm sure it's increased. Yeah, who knows what it is right now? And then I saw a very interesting poll just a few days ago. It was a survey taken of those displaced residents, the 60 to 80,000, and it found that the majority of them do not intend ever to return. So they have lost their sense of security, and say, like, even if the rocket barrages stop for a while, they're not going back because they don't believe that they're not going to start again. So that's actually quite interesting. That's
right. Well, then it makes them wonder if a lot of these maybe have just left the country and all. Because
I'm
they
sure
don't feel
some of them have. I'm sure some
Right.
of them have. I mean, these are also, a lot of them are farmers, and farmers are generally very attached to their land. I'll give you an example. There's South African farmers that were subjected to a lot of horrible violence. It may be continuing to some extent. I just haven't heard about it, but a few years ago. But they would not leave their land, because these were properties that had been in the family for many, many generations. Again, this is, we don't need to get into it, but South Africa is not a real analog to Israel. Israel talking about one generation. But in South Africa, you're talking about people who have been there for many generations. And maybe that's the difference. Maybe I just revealed the difference there. It's just like these were people that had real roots, and they would not, even though they knew there was a chance they could be brutally murdered, they would not leave their land. But these people, the residents of northern Israel, they had farms. I'm sure they're beautiful and whatever, but it's something they bought 20 years ago with money they made in the U.S. or something. And they say, okay, well, that didn't work out. Let's head back to the U.S. or
that the
go
U.S.
back to Tel
helped
Aviv.
pay for.
Yeah, quite possible. So it is different. They just don't have the roots that other peoples around the world have.
Right. Yeah. No. It's interesting to think about just what might be happening internally within Israel, because they're all Israelis, they're Jewish, but it's a real melting pot from all around the world. So there's different identities in there. One of the largest groups, I believe 20% of Israel is actually Russian or Ukrainian, Slavic, Russian speaking. And I find that kind of interesting because obviously here we have the Western world versus Russia right now, and Iran and BRICS. Russia and Iran are kind of are having this increasing friendliness between them and an alliance. So I wonder how if there's a large Russian population in there, how they feel about Russia right now. If at least they are probably.
I've been wondering the same thing. And some people, seem to assume that Russia has a lot of influence over them. But you may find it's like find in much of the West that the ones who left Russia are actually very anti-Russian. I mean, those are the kind of people, clearly not all of them, but you find those kind of people that are just fanatically anti-Putin, anti-Russian government. It may be to a lesser extent in Israel. The immigration pattern is different. I actually once started way back in the 80s. There was an effort to facilitate immigration of Jews out of the Soviet Union, and then later Russia. And I think, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was kind of a rush. People were just trying to get out of Russia because it was so awful during the 90s. So I think a lot of those people were just plain old economic refugees. But they may not, I think in general, they weren't political dissidents or Russia haters. But of course they left, I think most of those Russians in Israel, they left during the 1990s when Russia was at its worst and came to Israel when Israel was actually, a safe, prosperous country. And they probably say, we've come to the land of milk and honey. We escaped hell. And they, I think, kids grew up hearing stories about how awful Russia is. I'm just speculating here, but you may not find much of an attachment to Russia. I'm sure there are many important exceptions to that, but I think in general they're actually rather fanatically. Many of them are actually fanatic Zionists. Very strongly committed to the Netanyahu government.
Right. More my thinking is that Russian media might be penetrating Israeli society a little bit.
Yeah,
20% are Russian speaking.
I think as things change and they start to understand that, hey, that Russia now is not the Russia of the 1990s, and Israel is also not the Israel of the 1990s. There could be a chance of reverse migration. I think you're right. Yeah.
Right. Just because the information war is very important. And so when we see that the Western world, how the narrative is being shaped with all of Western media really trying, to boost Israel up, demonize Russia and Iran. But if you are in the Russian speaking information space, you're going to be getting something different. And the reality is that 20% of the Jewish Israeli population is Russian speaking, then I'm sure they are involved in these Russian Telegram channels. They're probably seeing Russian social media, and I'm sure they're getting a different information space that is not what the Western propaganda is seeing. And I believe that has to probably be causing some.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's it's solidly based speculation. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, yeah, but it is just speculation, so I guess we don't have to go further on that.
Yeah, no, but it's something like you say. It's something that we can watch.
Right. These are just little things that I feel like could be putting, straws on the scale for potential internal civil unrest or something else that could potentially resolve it if there's a mass exodus of Jews from Israel. At some point, if Israel's population gets too low, then it just will kind of collapse on itself, because Israel's supposed to be a safe haven for Jews. This is the land of the
Right,
Jews. Well, if
right.
all
There
the
could be
Jews
a
are
tipping
leaving,
point. Right.
right, it's health bar, right? It's getting too low, and then all of a sudden just
Yeah, it could. It's just like a run on a bank. At some point, it could be that there will be a mass exodus. There's a real risk of that. That's true.
right. That's what I hope, that we could get that peaceful solution, and that's one of the reasons I started asking about whether Iran would attack. It seems clear that Israel's bent on this escalation, and maybe it is a smart move for Iran to retaliate. But maybe
It depends
we could
on the
avoid...
target that they choose, and if it has a spectacular effect that cannot be hidden from the Israeli population, it could very easily give a big push to that process, of the process of emigration.
Right. Okay, well, I mentioned at the beginning that we would try to cover a little bit of Russia, Ukraine, and we're coming close to the end, so we'll try to pivot over there real quick. Maybe you can just start us off by giving us just the big major developments, because I'm hearing things about Ukraine front collapsing, but we've been kind of saying that slow collapse for months. So tell us what's happening.
Well, I guess you could say in one way that yes, the trend that we described earlier hasn't changed, but it was an accelerating trend. You said that the Russian advances have become greater and greater. They're happening faster and faster, and that's continued to be true. So, like in the last week or so, we probably saw the fastest and largest advance that we've seen so far in the last couple of years by Russia. They've seized. Well, just to give you one example, there was the town of Selidovo, which had 20,000 people before the war, and they took it very quickly. They spent some time kind of moving around it and like they do, very methodically seizing positions and encircling it, but then when they stormed it, it fell in just a few days, fell entirely, and because it fell so fast, very little damage was done to Selidovo. That's actually very good news. One of the horrors of this war is not just the many deaths on both sides, especially the Ukrainian side, but just the utter obliteration of some of these cities that the Ukraine armed forces have been using as fortresses. They hole up in the basements and in the high rises and fight to the last man. So it's just like building after building gets destroyed inevitably. It just is a result of combat. It's not a deliberate policy at all by the Russians. Obviously they would try to wish to avoid this because they're the ones that are going to have to rebuild. But recently, in Selidovo, and then there was another town of a similar size, I think about a month ago, that also was taken very quickly. You're just not seeing the same kind of damage, and that's a good trend. So the collapse is continuing. It started off as a slow motion collapse. I think you could say starting about 2-3 months ago. Of course, the critical battle really was Avdiivka. After the Avdiivka fell, then we began to see this the Russians spread out and start to attack a lot of different villages and towns to the west of Avdiivka and to the north and the south. And then starting maybe 3 months ago, you say the first signs of a collapse. And that collapse was a very slow motion collapse. But now you get just like the speed of the film is gradually increasing, and it's happening faster and faster. So it was before you would say, well, okay, yeah, they're moving faster than they did before, but at this rate, it's going to be another 3 years before they finally make it to the Dnieper. Now it's going to be another 6 months. That's actually, if it doesn't accelerate further, but they just continue at the current rate, they're going to be the Dnieper in 6 months. And I think there's every reason to believe that it will accelerate. So, we are looking at a collapse.
Okay. Well, it seems like now really what dominates the media for the Ukraine-Russian conflict is all this chatter about the North Korean troops, and
that's
Biden
really
is
funny.
talking. Right. So
it's just really bizarre. I say, who knows, but I don't see any reason why the North Koreans would fight. And so I would be very, very surprised if they actually are, if they enter combat anywhere. And you see these reports. Actually, they've gone beyond like they're already fighting, and they've already been North Korean troop concentrations have been hit by Ukrainian missiles. Actually, some North Koreans have already defected to the Ukrainian side. Again, there's absolutely no evidence for any of this. It becomes this really elaborate story that keeps on spreading. It's just really funny. And you see it in all kinds of media, Western media. But I think it's all coming from Ukraine. Ukraine's just spoon feeding this wild fantasy, and they're repeating it. But if you look at like the statements that the Pentagon makes, they're much more careful, and they'll say, we have intelligence that there are North Koreans in Russia, but we don't have any intelligence that they're going to Kursk or Ukraine. And of course, we too have intelligence that there were North Koreans in Russia.
Right.
Your sister, saw some North Korean soldiers there on the metro. But big deal. So what? They're allies. Of course, you're going to see North Koreans in Russia. But this whole thing, it just seems to be an elaborate fantasy, and I wonder how long it's going to go. There have been fantasies that the Ukrainians have cooked up in the past, but they usually last maybe at the most a week. This one just keeps on getting more elaborate. It's going to start. They're going to start talking about actual battles and paratroopers, North Korean paratroopers, and being surrounded and whatever, and just.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know how far they're going to take this.
Right. I just found it very interesting because, like you said, North Korea and Russia have a mutual defense treaty. It just makes sense that you'll see military personnel from Russia in North Korea and military personnel from North Korea in Russia. It's just part of the defense treaty. I mean, America, we have military presence in over in like 100 countries, right? So it's
right.
So what's the obsession? Why is this Western media obsession over North Korea? Is it just? Well, I'll just let you take it from there.
Well, yeah, part of it is Ukraine is always just kind of. I think Ukraine is getting desperate, and they're just kind of Zelensky's victory plan just fell. It was a total abject failure, right? It fell completely flat, and they know that they're losing. And so they're just going kind of from one wild scheme to another. He said, well, maybe if we can convince them that the North Koreans are fighting, that'll get them, riled up, and they'll send some of their own troops. I think it's something like that. And so, again, it's just that when we have our Western media just faithfully reports anything that the Ukrainians tell them. I mean, you just get... I continue to follow like the mainstream, let's say, kind of... the kind of Western media that I think the average consumer of news in the West consumes. And it's all along, in spite of the obvious Russian victories and the obvious fact that the Russians are winning, it continues to be about amazing deeds by Ukrainians and stupid, savage, orcish Russians. And this is just another, kind of a particularly wild manifestation of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, why do you think Western leaders, European leaders, are so reluctant to engage in diplomacy with Russia? I mean, it seems like they seem terrified of the prospect of negotiating a peace settlement, when really clearly the most terrifying prospect is having NATO troops enter into a conflict with Russia. That's the truly terrifying thing. But it seems like that's the line that most Western leaders are going down, instead of the much more pragmatic, realistic, and less terrifying, not the nuclear option of let's have peace talks. Let's save as many Ukrainian lives as we can. I mean, Ukraine has been destroyed. Why?
Yeah. Well, again, it's just that they're irrational. They're deluded. In particular, to be more specific, they've demonized Russia and especially President Putin to such an extent that they can't talk with him. How can you talk with the devil? And they've made him out to be Hitler. The whole thing is completely absurd. And, say you can't negotiate with Hitler. The only thing he understands is force. I watched an interview, I guess, who's on the Duran with George Beebe, who's a former, Russia analyst in the U.S. government, very, very high level, very smart guy. And he was saying that, in the 99% of conflicts, the best way to deal with them is through diplomacy. and you always can come to some kind of solution. It's just there's one exception to that. It's when you have a truly expansionist power that's just hell bent on seizing territory, and he gave it as an example. It's overused, but it's true as far as it goes. Nazi Germany again, Nazi Germany wasn't interested in the West, but they were interested in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They wanted to seize those territories, and I think they really were hell bent on doing that. And so that's always brought up, and it's applied to Russia, for example. But it just does not. I mean, it's a false application. I mean, Russia is not that power. Russia wanted to negotiate. It's just clear for anybody who looks into the history. They were trying to negotiate. They were trying to negotiate. They were not that expansionist power. They did not, even when the Donbass, back in 2014, actually just kind of begged Russia to take them in and make them part of Russia. Putin refused. He wanted to negotiate with the West. But that's the model that they have in their heads, and they made Putin out to be Hitler, and it's just a completely false model. It's a delusion, but it means that they can't make rational decisions. In the end, I think the whole thing will fall apart because it is so utterly false. At some point, unless they do something really, really stupid and actually do send lots of troops Western troops into Ukraine. It will fall apart. And then who knows, hopefully, I hope they just sober up, or, realistic parties come to power. And again, I think there's reasons to be very hopeful, to be somewhat hopeful in Europe, more so than in the U.S. Again, because we do find other parties that are coming to power, or, are threatening, or actually have won elections, but because of, again, the shenanigans by the establishment, have not actually been able to take power. But eventually they may take power, and that would be good news. And just on that particular subject, I wanted to add some interesting information that I found recently. I was saying that an unfortunate aspect of these, let's say, dissident anti-globalist parties is that the ones on the right, like National Rally in France, or the AfD in Germany, tend to also be very Zionist. But I said I felt that was kind of a shallow Zionism. It was just sort of more of a political tactic than anything. It's not like what you find in the U.S. And then I saw a poll came out recently that showed a dramatic shift actually within the AfD membership in their attitudes towards Israel. And now it's like only 19% are firm supporters of Israel. So within it's really
AfD itself.
Within the AfD. And there's also, it's not just them, but there was a leader of the AfD who was saying that, we need to distance ourselves from Israel. So that's good news. So again, I think there's reasons you see signs of actual rationality not within the establishment. But that establishment, and to a great extent, has actually kind of sold their souls to the U.S. But those groups, those political parties within Europe that have not sold their souls to the U.S. are showing that they are rational, and they can, and if they do come to power, I think we have, and they could, especially when this Ukraine project just ends in total undeniable disaster, they could really come to power, and we could see a new Europe. I hope so. I have some optimism there.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, I hope so. It seems like leaders that have tied themselves to the United States are being punished severely in Europe, and hopefully the democratic institutions that we praise so much here in the West will actually hold and work, and then we can see a real change.
The establishment is really fighting against democracy there, but they may lose, and this may be.
Well, they got to do that to save democracy, Dad.
Yeah,
you understand, right? That's how it works.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks for all that. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or should we end it there?
No, I think that's fine. I think that does
great. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.